As the last ship slipped beneath the waves, the battle's end was written, not by admirals,
February
but by the
17,
men watching.
1944.
Before any
4 Japanese
gunfire,
warships
before any
vanish in
ship
90
turned,
minutes.
war
Not
began
from aerial
here,
bombs,
in silence.
not from torpedoes,
Code break
from
to the
shells
Pacific
fired
was
by
vast,
guns so far
unforgiving,
away
and blind.
the enemy couldn't even
Radar
see them.
became the fleet's new eyes,
23
revealing enemy
miles.
shadows long
That's
before
the
they broke
distance
the
where
horizon.
USS Iowa demonstrated something the Imperial Japanese Navy thought was impossible. And the man who made it possible wasn't an admiral or a genius scientist. He was a 32-year-old lieutenant from Iowa named James Mitchell, a former high school math teacher who enlisted after Pearl Harbor. What he helped create would rewrite every rule of naval warfare and prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the biggest gun. It's the ability to use it with deadly precision. By the time those 4 ships sank, Japanese admirals realized they'd been fighting the wrong war with the wrong strategy. But it was already too late. Let's go back to early 1943, because to understand what happened at Truk Lagoon, you need to understand the problem that was killing American sailors by the hundreds. The Pacific War was in its 2nd year. The United States had stopped Japan's advance at Midway and Guadalcanal, but now came the hard part, pushing across thousands of miles of ocean to reach the Japanese home islands. And there was a massive problem. Japanese warships, especially their battleships, were built around a doctrine called Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. Every Japanese naval officer had been trained since academy days to believe in this moment, a massive fleet engagement, where superior Japanese fighting spirit and years of rigorous training would destroy the American battle line at medium range, probably 10 to 15 miles. That's where Japanese optical rangefinders worked best. That's where crew skill mattered most. That's where Bushido, the warrior spirit, would overcome American material advantages. The Americans had their own battleships, of course. The old ones had been sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor, but by 1943, new ones were coming off the shipyards. The North Carolina class, the South Dakota class, and now the Iowa class, the fastest, most advanced battleships ever built by the United States Navy. On paper, they were magnificent. 887 feet long, 33 knots maximum speed, 9 16-inch guns that could throw a 2 700-pound armor-piercing shell over 20 miles. But there was a problem, and it was the same problem every navy in the world faced. Nobody could hit anything at maximum range. Battleship guns had theoretical ranges that looked impressive in specifications. Japanese Yamato-class battleships mounted 18-inch guns with a theoretical maximum range of 25 miles. American Iowa-class ships could reach 23 miles. But theoretical range and effective range were completely different things. At 15 miles, a battleship firing at another battleship needed to account for dozens of variables. The speed and course of both ships, wind direction and velocity, air temperature and density, the rotation of the Earth itself, because a shell in flight for over a minute would be affected by the Coriolis effect. Even the wear on gun barrels, which slightly reduced muzzle velocity after repeated firings. Traditional fire control used optical rangefinders. Massive instruments mounted in armored positions using overlapping images through precisely calibrated lenses to calculate distance. They were engineering marvels, some of the most sophisticated optical instruments ever built. Japanese rangefinders on the Yamato were over 50 feet long. They were accurate, reliable, and they had one fatal limitation. They only worked if you could see the target clearly. In fog at night beyond the horizon or at extreme distances where atmospheric haze made precise measurement impossible, optical rangefinders became guesswork. You fired a salvo, watched where the shells landed, adjusted your aim, and fired again. It was an iterative process. 20, 30, sometimes 40 salvos to score hits on a maneuvering target at maximum range. By that time, you'd expended hundreds of shells and given the enemy plenty of time to close range or escape. The Americans knew this. Every navy knew this. What made the difference, what would eventually shock Japanese admirals into disbelief, was that the Americans were quietly solving this problem with technology nobody else had fully integrated. Radar. Not just for detecting ships and aircraft, but for fire control. for calculating exact range and bearing, continuously feeding that data into mechanical computers that could solve the ballistic equations in real time. But in early 1943, this system was still being refined, still being tested, and most importantly, still being doubted by many officers in the U.S. Navy. Because the old guard, the admirals who'd spent their careers learning optical gunnery, didn't quite trust machines to do what trained human eyes and brains had always done. This is where James Mitchell enters the story. Lieutenant James Mitchell had been teaching advanced mathematics at Roosevelt High School in Des Moines, Iowa, when Pearl Harbor was attacked. He was 30 years old, married with a deferment he could have kept. But on December 8, 1941, he drove to the nearest Navy recruiting office and volunteered. He wanted destroyers. Fast, aggressive, the ships that got into the thick of combat. The Navy looked at his degree in mathematics and physics from Iowa State and said, "No, you're going to be a fire control officer." Mitchell had no idea what that meant. 6 months later, after intensive training at the Naval Fire Control School in Washington, D.C., he understood. Fire control was the science and art of making guns hit what they aimed at, and it was far more complex than he'd imagined. The systems fascinated him. The Mark 1A fire control computer was a mechanical marvel, thousands of gears and cams and linkages solving differential equations mechanically. The Mark 8 radar could track targets beyond visual range. But there was a gap, a disconnect between what the technology could theoretically do and what was actually being done in combat. In early 1943, Mitchell was assigned to USS Iowa, BB-61, the lead ship of her class. She was being fitted out at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Mitchell reported aboard in March and met the ship's gunnery officer, Commander Richard O'Brien, a veteran of pre-war Pacific Fleet exercises. O'Brien was skeptical. He'd seen the new radar fire control demonstrated in tests. Impressive, sure, but tests weren't combat. In combat, you had damaged equipment interference, split-second decisions. O'Brien believed radar could supplement optical fire control, but he didn't believe it could replace it. Most of the senior officers agreed. Mitchell kept quiet. He was a lieutenant brand new to the ship, and these men had decades of experience. But at night, down in the fire control spaces, Mitchell studied the systems. He ran calculations. He discovered something the designers already knew, but that wasn't being fully exploited. The Mark 1A computer combined with Mark 8 radar could calculate firing solutions at ranges where optical rangefinders were nearly useless. But it required trusting the technology completely, feeding it accurate data, understanding that the computer's solution might look wrong to human intuition but was actually correct when you factored in all the variables. One night in April 1943, Iowa was conducting shakedown exercises off the Virginia coast. The ship was firing at towed targets at various ranges. Commander O'Brien was in the main fire control station. Mitchell was at his station in the secondary position. At 18,000 yards, just over 10 miles, the optical rangefinder got a good fix on the target. The first salvo straddled it beautifully. Hits on the third salvo. Textbook gunnery. Then O'Brien ordered them to increase range to 30,000 yards. 17 miles. At that distance, the target was barely visible, a speck on the horizon. The optical rangefinder struggled. The first salvo fell short by 500 yards. The second overshot. The third was closer, but still no hits. After 6 salvos and no hits, O'Brien shook his head. He said, "This is why maximum range is theoretical. You can't hit what you can't see clearly." Mitchell spoke up. He said, "Sir, request permission to use radar fire control exclusively for the next series." O'Brien looked at him. The entire fire control crew was listening. Mitchell explained quickly. "The radar has exact range and bearing. The computer can calculate the solution if we trust it, and don't try to correct based on visual observation of fall of shot." O'Brien considered. They were in exercises, not combat. If Mitchell wanted to prove or disprove his theory, now was the time. He said, "All right, Lieutenant. Show me what your magic box can do." Mitchell took control. He ordered the radar operators to lock onto the target and feed continuous data to the computer. He input the target's estimated speed, though it was being towed at a constant rate, so that was easy. He set the wind conditions from the ship's instruments. Then, he did something that made the experienced gunners nervous. He told them to ignore what their eyes told them about where the shells were landing and fire strictly according to the computer's corrections. The first salvo fired. Through binoculars, observers saw the splashes. They were close, very close, but the exact distance was hard to judge at 17 miles. The computer made a tiny correction less than 100 yards. The second salvo fired. 2 shells hit the target. The third salvo, fired 15 seconds later, scored 3 more hits. The fire control station went quiet. They'd just done in 3 salvos what had taken 6 salvos with optical control, and they'd done it at a range where the target was barely visible. Commander O'Brien walked over to Mitchell's station. He looked at the radar display at the computer readouts at the young lieutenant who'd just demonstrated something that contradicted 30 years of naval gunnery doctrine. O'Brien said quietly, "Do that again." They did. 5 more practice runs at ranges between 15 and 20 miles. Each time radar fire control scored hits faster and with fewer rounds expended than optical control. The data was undeniable. O'Brien wrote a report. He sent it up through channels to the gunnery department at the Bureau of Ordnance. Mitchell thought that would be the end of it. Maybe the system would be noted for future development. Maybe other ships would start practicing the technique. What he didn't know was that his demonstration had arrived at exactly the right moment. Because in the summer of 1943, Admiral Raymond Spruance, who'd commanded at Midway and was now planning the Central Pacific Offensive, had a problem. Japanese naval forces were concentrated at places like Truk Lagoon, a massive natural harbor in the Caroline Islands. Truk was Japan's Pearl Harbor, their main forward base. It was protected by reefs, defended by hundreds of aircraft, and garrisoned by some of their best ships. American submarines had been picking off Japanese vessels outside Truk for months, but submarines couldn't assault a defended harbor. Carrier aircraft could, but carriers were vulnerable. They needed to get close to launch their planes. If Japanese surface ships sallied out to defend Truk, there could be a surface engagement. And Spruance wanted to be ready. He wanted his battleships to be able to engage Japanese warships at maximum effective range. Not to close and brawl at 10 miles, but to stand off and systematically destroy enemy ships before they could bring their own weapons to bear. He needed proof that it could be done. O'Brien's report landed on the desk of Admiral Willis Lee, commander of Battleship Division 6, which included Iowa and her sister ship New Jersey. Lee was one of the few senior admirals who understood technology. He'd been a champion marksman in his youth. He understood that precision mattered more than volume of fire. He read Mitchell's test results and immediately ordered Iowa to conduct more extensive trials. In August 1943, Iowa went back out for gunnery exercises. This time Admiral Lee himself was aboard. They set up targets at 20,000 yards, 25,000 yards, 30,000 yards, even 35,000 yards, nearly 20 miles. Mitchell ran the radar fire control. The results were consistent. At ranges where optical fire control achieved maybe 10% hit rate after many salvos, radar fire control achieved 30 to 40% hit rate in the first 3 salvos. The difference was staggering. Lee understood immediately what this meant. American battleships could engage Japanese warships at ranges the Japanese had never seriously trained for, had never seriously considered possible. Japanese doctrine was built around closing to medium range. Their optical fire control was excellent at 10 to 15 miles. But if American battleships could accurately engage at 18, 20, even 23 miles, Japanese ships would be under devastating fire before they could effectively return it. Lee wrote his own report. It went directly to Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations. King was a hard man, demanding, often abrasive, but he recognized capability when he saw it. He ordered immediate implementation across the fleet. All Iowa-class and South Dakota-class battleships were to conduct intensive radar fire control training. Officers like Mitchell, who understood the systems, were to train others. By late 1943, the doctrine was changing. But doctrine and reality are different things. Paper training and combat are different things. And the Japanese had no idea this was happening. Their intelligence services knew Americans had radar. They knew Americans had mechanical fire control computers. What they didn't know, what they couldn't quite believe, even when reports filtered through, was that the Americans had integrated these technologies into a system that fundamentally changed the effective range of naval gunnery. Japanese battleships still trained for the decisive battle at medium range. They practiced night fighting. They drilled on torpedo attacks. They maintained their optical fire control systems, which were among the best in the world. And they waited for the Americans to come close enough to fight on Japanese terms. In February 1944, the time came. Operation Hailstone, the assault on Truk, was launched. Admiral Spruance commanded the Fifth Fleet. Admiral Mitcher commanded the carrier task forces. And Admiral Lee commanded the battleships, including Iowa and New Jersey. The plan was for carrier aircraft to strike Truk on February 17th, destroying as many ships and aircraft as possible. But intelligence suggested some Japanese warships might try to escape. If they did, Spruance wanted a surface action. He wanted to test in combat what Mitchell and others had proven in exercises. He wanted to demonstrate that American battleships could hunt down and destroy Japanese warships at ranges the enemy thought impossible. The morning of February 17, 1944, carrier aircraft from Task Force 58 began their assault on Truk. Wave after wave of bombers and torpedo planes swept over the lagoon. Japanese ships caught by surprise were destroyed at anchor. The light cruiser Katori, however, along with destroyers, Maikaze and Nowaki auxiliary cruiser, Akagi Maru, and a small minesweeper, had slipped out before dawn. They were running north, hoping to reach Saipan, hoping the Americans would be too busy to notice. American reconnaissance planes spotted them. Reports reached Spruance. He made his decision. Form Task Group 50.9. Battleships Iowa and New Jersey. Heavy cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans. 4 destroyers for screening. Light carrier cowpens for air cover. And the mission: pursue and destroy the fleeing Japanese vessels. This was it. The moment Mitchell had been training for. The moment that would prove or disprove everything they believed about radar fire control. As Iowa surged forward at 33 knots, cutting through Pacific waters toward an enemy they couldn't yet see, Mitchell stood in the fire control center, checking his equipment one more time. The Mark 8 radar screen glowed green in the darkened fire control center. Lieutenant James Mitchell watched the dots representing Japanese warships move steadily northeast 32,000 yards away. 18 miles. Beyond visual range. Beyond where any battleship had ever scored hits in combat. But Mitchell had proven it could be done in exercises off Virginia. He'd demonstrated it to Admiral Lee himself. Now in waters northwest of Truk, with smoke from burning Japanese ships visible on the horizon behind them, he had one chance to prove that radar fire control wasn't just a training exercise. Curiosity. It was a weapon that could change naval warfare forever. The problem was that half the officers on Iowa's bridge still didn't believe it. And if this engagement went wrong, if they expended hundreds of shells and scored no hits, Mitchell's career would end, and radar fire control would be dismissed as a promising technology that failed under combat conditions. The stakes were higher than 4 fleeing Japanese ships. The stakes were the future of naval gunnery itself. And things were about to get worse before they got better. Commander Richard O'Brien stood beside Mitchell in the fire control station. O'Brien had submitted the report about the Virginia trials. He'd vouched for Mitchell. But now, with Captain John McCree on the bridge, demanding results, and Admiral Spruance watching from cruiser Indianapolis, O'Brien was feeling the pressure. At 14:30 hours, as Iowa closed to 30,000 yards, O'Brien said quietly to Mitchell, If we don't get hits in the first 5 salvos, I'm switching to optical control. Mitchell felt his stomach drop. 5 salvos at extreme range. That was maybe 3 minutes of firing. In exercises, they'd sometimes needed 7 or 8 salvos to find the range and establish the pattern. But O'Brien wasn't being unreasonable. In combat, ammunition mattered. Time mattered. If radar control couldn't deliver faster than optical control, what was the point? Mitchell nodded. He understood. He checked his equipment one more time. The radar was tracking Katori clearly. Range 29, 500 yards, and closing. The rangekeeper computer hummed calculating solutions continuously. Wind data was coming in from topside instruments. Everything was optimal. But optimal conditions in combat meant something different than optimal in exercises. There were no second chances here. The real obstacle wasn't the technology. It was the man who'd spent the last 2 hours arguing against this entire engagement. Captain Arnold Bennett, commanding officer of Heavy Cruiser Minneapolis, had made his opinion clear over tactical radio. Bennett was 54 years old, a Naval Academy graduate who'd served on battleships in World War I. He'd watched optical fire control evolve over 3 decades. He'd seen plenty of promising technologies fail under combat stress. And he thought using untested radar fire control in the first major surface engagement of the Pacific War was reckless. At 13:15 hours, when Admiral Spruance had formed Task Group 50.9 and ordered the pursuit, Bennett had transmitted. "With all respect, sir, recommend carrier aircraft finish these targets." Spruance had replied tersely, "Negative." "Surface action." Bennett tried again. "Sir, maximum effective range for battleship guns is 25,000 yards under optimal conditions. Enemy vessels are currently at 32,000 and pulling away. Will expend magazines and score nothing." There had been a long pause. Then Admiral Willis Lee embarked on Iowa, and commanding the battleship division had cut in. "Captain Bennett, this is Admiral Lee. We will engage at maximum radar fire control range. That is a direct order." Bennett had responded with a clipped "Aye, sir," but everyone listening knew he thought it was a mistake. The tension had been building for months. Bennett represented the old guard officers who'd come up through the ranks learning traditional gunnery, who trusted their eyes and their experience more than machines. They weren't stupid. They weren't ignorant. They were professionals who'd seen technology fail. In the 1920s, the Navy had tested gyroscopic bomb sights that were supposed to revolutionize accuracy. They'd failed spectacularly. In the 1930s, there'd been experimental fire control systems using vacuum tubes that worked perfectly in testing and then broke down in rough seas. So when junior officers like Mitchell claimed radar could do what human eyes couldn't, experienced captains like Bennett were skeptical. And they had organizational power. Bennett had allies on the naval staff in Pearl Harbor and Washington. If this engagement failed, if Iowa expended 200 shells and scored no hits, those allies would use it as evidence that radar fire control was another expensive boondoggle. Mitchell knew this because O'Brien had told him bluntly 2 days earlier. "There are officers in Buord who want this whole radar program shut down," O'Brien had said. "They think it's taking resources from proven systems. If we fail publicly, they'll have the ammunition they need to kill it. No pressure, Lieutenant, but you're fighting for more than your career here." The irony was that Mitchell had an unexpected ally in Admiral Lee. Willis Augustus Lee was unusual among flag officers. He'd won 5 gold medals in shooting at the 1920 Olympics. He understood that marksmanship wasn't about strength or courage. It was about precision calculation, eliminating variables. When he'd read O'Brien's report about the Virginia trials, Lee had immediately grasped what radar fire control represented. It wasn't replacing human skill. It was augmenting it, allowing human gunners to hit targets at ranges where human eyes simply couldn't provide accurate data. Lee had personally attended Iowa's training exercises in August 1943. He'd watched Mitchell run the system. He'd reviewed the data cold statistics that showed 30 to 40% hit rates at ranges where optical control achieved less than 10%. After that exercise, Lee had taken Mitchell aside. The admiral had said, "Lieutenant, there are going to be officers who hate what you're doing. They'll see it as disrespecting decades of naval tradition. They'll argue that technology can't replace experience. Don't let them shake you. The numbers don't lie. You're right, and eventually everyone will see it. But you'll need to prove it in combat first." That day had arrived. At 14:45 hours, Iowa reached 28,000 yards, 15.5 miles. Mitchell could see Katori through binoculars, a gray speck on the horizon, but determining exact range optically was impossible at this distance. The radar had no such problem. Range 27, 800 yards. Target speed, 26 knots. Target course, 0.15 degrees northeast. The rangekeeper calculated the firing solution. Barrel elevation, 37 degrees. Lead angle 4.3 degrees to port to account for the target's movement and Iowa's own course. Time of flight for the shells would be 52 seconds. In that time, Katori would travel approximately 390 yards. The computer predicted her position. All Mitchell had to do was trust it. Captain McCree's voice came over the intercom from the bridge. "Fire control, you have permission to engage when ready." Mitchell took a breath. He keyed his microphone. "Turret 2 load high capacity. Prepare to fire on solution." Down in Turret 2, 40 feet below Mitchell's station, gun crews loaded 3 shells into the massive breeches. Each shell weighed 1,900 pounds. Each powder charge weighed 660 pounds, divided into 6 silk bags. The breech blocks closed with hydraulic precision. Turret 2 reported loaded and ready. Mitchell checked his display one more time. The solution looked perfect. "Fire Turret 2." The deck shuddered. The overpressure wave from the 3 16-inch guns firing simultaneously was like a physical blow. Even inside the fire control station, Mitchell felt it. 3 1,900-pound shells arced into the sky at 2,600 feet per second. 52 seconds later, they would land. Mitchell counted. Everyone in fire control counted. At extreme range, you couldn't see shell splashes clearly through binoculars. The radar tracked the shell's ballistic trajectory, showing their descent. Splash. The radar operator called it out. 1 short, 2 long. Straddle. That was exactly what they wanted. The first salvo had bracketed the target. Now the computer made minute adjustments. Mitchell watched the solution update. The second salvo would be dead on. Fire Turret 2. Another shuddering roar. Another 52-second wait. This time, the observer in Iowa's main fire control director tower had powerful optics trained on Katori. He called out multiple hits on target. Superstructure and midships. Mitchell felt relief flood through him, but there was no time to celebrate. Katori was maneuvering now, turning to port, possibly trying to launch torpedoes. The rangekeeper tracked her course change, updating the solution continuously. Fire Turret 1. Fire Turret 3. Iowa's other 2 turrets joined the engagement. Now, all 9 16-inch guns were firing, cycling as fast as gun crews could reload. The third full salvo, 20 seconds after the second, scored more hits. The fourth salvo tore into Katori's engineering spaces. Smoke poured from her. She was listing. On Minneapolis, Captain Bennett watched through his own binoculars. He'd seen the hits. He'd counted the salvos. 4 salvos, maybe 15 seconds of actual firing time spread over 2 minutes, and the Japanese cruiser was dying. At that range, optical fire control would still be trying to find the target. Bennett keyed his radio. "Iowa, this is Minneapolis actual. That was exceptional shooting. Request permission to close and engage with main battery." Admiral Lee responded, "Granted Minneapolis. Close to 20,000 yards and engage. Cruisers will finish Katori. Battleships will pursue the destroyers." Bennett brought Minneapolis around. As his ship closed range, he transmitted on a private channel to his gunnery officer. "Did you see that 4 salvos, and they're hitting consistently at 28,000? His gunnery officer, a lieutenant commander named Walsh, who'd served with Bennett for 3 years, replied, "Yes, sir. I've never seen anything like it." Bennett said quietly, "Neither have I. Maybe these radar boys are onto something after all." That simple statement, transmitted over radio and logged in Iowa's communication records, represented a watershed moment. Captain Arnold Bennett, one of the Navy's most vocal skeptics of radar fire control, had just acknowledged its effectiveness in combat. Word would spread. Other commanding officers would review the action reports. The old guard wouldn't disappear overnight, but the tide had shifted. At 14:59 hours, Katori rolled over and sank. Captain Takao Saji went down with his ship. Of approximately 300 crew members, none survived. Destroyer Maikaze attempted to stand by, laying smoke, launching torpedoes desperately toward Iowa and New Jersey. The torpedoes missed by hundreds of yards. The destroyers couldn't get accurate range on targets moving at 33 knots, nearly 16 miles away. But Iowa and New Jersey had no such problem. Their radar tracked Maikaze precisely. The battleships opened fire. Maikaze absorbed punishment that should have sunk 3 destroyers her size. Her 2,000-ton displacement meant she had minimal armor. The 900-pound shells, even near misses, caused catastrophic damage. Splinters from shells exploding in the water alongside tore through her thin hull plating. Direct hits were worse. One shell penetrated her forward magazine. The explosion broke her keel. She jackknifed bow and stern, rising as the center collapsed. She sank at 1506 hours. All hands lost. The third destroyer, Nowaki, saw what happened and made a run for it. She was faster than the battleships, capable of 35 knots maximum. She had a head start. Range opened. 30,000 yards. 32,000. 34,000. 19 miles. At this point, optical fire control would have ceased fire. The target was too far, too fast, and pulling away. Chasing would waste ammunition. But Admiral Lee wanted to demonstrate maximum capability. He ordered Iowa and New Jersey to continue firing. This wasn't about sinking Nowaki anymore. This was about establishing a record proving that radar fire control could engage effectively at ranges previously thought impossible. At 35,700 yards, 20.3 statute miles. New Jersey fired a 9-gun salvo. Time of flight was over 90 seconds. The shells climbed to altitudes exceeding 7 miles before descending. At maximum elevation, the trajectory was almost like artillery, the shells disappearing into clouds before plunging back down. The salvo straddled Nowaki. Shells landed to port and starboard. Splinters caused casualties and minor damage, but the destroyer was pulling away. She disappeared into rain squalls and escaped. But New Jersey had just set a record. The longest range gunnery engagement between surface vessels ever recorded. 20.3 miles. A record that stands today and likely will stand forever because no Navy builds battleships anymore. When Task Group 59 returned to the fleet at 1700 hours, Captain McCree assembled Iowa's officers in the wardroom. He'd received a personal message from Admiral Spruance. "Excellent shooting today. Stop radar fire control. Proved combat effective. Stop recommend immediate fleet-wide training implementation. Stop, well done." McCree looked at Mitchell and O'Brien. "Gentlemen," he said, "I believe you've just changed naval warfare." Mitchell felt exhausted. The tension, the pressure of knowing that failure would doom not just his career, but an entire technology had drained him. But there was satisfaction too. They'd proven it. In combat, against a real enemy. Under pressure. The skeptics would still exist, but they'd lost their main argument. They could no longer say radar fire control was unproven. The success created immediate logistical challenges. Every battleship and heavy cruiser in the Pacific Fleet needed to be trained in radar fire control techniques. The equipment was already installed that had been done during construction or refits, but operating it effectively required understanding, practice, trust in the technology. Mitchell received orders the next day. He was being temporarily reassigned to Admiral Nimitz's staff in Pearl Harbor. His new job was to develop training protocols, write manuals, and personally instruct gunnery officers from other ships. It was a desk job mostly, but critically important. Within 2 weeks, Mitchell was standing in a classroom at Pearl Harbor Naval Base, teaching 20 captains and gunnery officers from ships across the fleet. He showed them the data from Truk. He explained the principles. He answered skeptical questions. How do you know the radar reading is accurate? Because we cross-check with multiple systems and verify in exercises. What if the radar breaks during combat? You revert to optical control same as before, but radar gives you an additional capability. What if the enemy jams the radar? Current Japanese forces don't have effective jamming capabilities, and even if they did, we're developing frequency hopping techniques. Slowly, methodically, Mitchell converted skeptics into believers. By March 1944, radar fire control doctrine was being implemented across the fleet. Ships scheduled for the upcoming Marianas campaign practiced the techniques. Hit rates at extreme range improved dramatically across the board. But success brought new problems. Japanese intelligence services, piecing together reports from survivors and coast watchers, realized something had changed. American battleships were hitting at ranges that shouldn't be possible. The reports were fragmentary and confused, but the pattern was clear. At first, Japanese naval staff dismissed them. Perhaps the observers were mistaken. Perhaps the Americans had gotten lucky. But when multiple reports from different engagements showed the same pattern, they had to acknowledge reality. The Americans had developed something new, something dangerous. Japanese engineers began studying their own radar systems, trying to integrate them into fire control. But it wasn't simple. Radar technology was one thing. Building analog computers that could process that data in real time was another. Training crew to trust the systems was a third challenge. And Japan in 1944 lacked the industrial capacity, resources, and time to implement such sweeping changes. The window for catching up had closed. There was another complication Mitchell learned about through O'Brien. Intelligence reports suggested there might be a security leak. Someone was providing detailed information to Japanese agents about American naval technology. The FBI and naval intelligence were investigating. Mitchell had to submit to interviews, provide documentation of everyone he'd trained, account for every manual he'd written. It was frustrating, but necessary. If the Japanese got complete technical specifications of the Mark 8 radar and Mark 1A computer, they might find vulnerabilities, ways to jam or deceive the systems. For 2 weeks in April, Mitchell lived under a cloud of suspicion. Then, naval intelligence arrested someone, a civilian contractor working at the Navy Yard in Mare Island. The man had been photographing documents and passing them through intermediaries to Japanese intelligence. Among the documents he'd copied were preliminary radar fire control manuals. Mitchell never learned the full details. That information was classified. But O'Brien told him privately that the leak had been contained before critical specifications were compromised. The Japanese might know that Americans had radar fire control, but they didn't know exactly how it worked or its limitations. By May 1944, Mitchell was back on Iowa. The ship had been in dock for maintenance and upgrades. New radar equipment improved computer systems, minor refinements based on lessons from Truk. Iowa sailed in early June as part of the force supporting the invasion of Saipan. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Iowa and other battleships formed a defensive screen around the carriers. Japanese aircraft attacked in waves. The battleship's 5-inch dual-purpose guns, also directed by radar fire control, shot down dozens of planes. The battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 600 Japanese aircraft destroyed. American losses less than 30 planes. But there were no surface engagements. Japanese battleships Yamato and Musashi, somewhere in the Philippine archipelago, didn't sortie. They stayed in port, conserving fuel, waiting for the decisive battle that never came. Mitchell wondered if Japanese admirals, learning about what happened at Truk, had decided that closing to medium range against American radar fire control wasn't a viable strategy anymore. If so, That meant the entire Japanese naval doctrine, everything they'd trained for, was obsolete. It meant they'd lost the war before the final battles were even fought. Back in Washington, the Bureau of Ordnance published a comprehensive report on the Truk engagement. It included charts showing hit rates at various ranges, comparing radar fire control to optical fire control. The difference was stark. At 25,000 yards, optical control achieved hits with approximately 25% of salvos. Radar control achieved hits with 60% of salvos. At 30,000 yards, optical control was down to 5%. Radar control maintained 40%. The report concluded that radar fire control represented a fundamental shift in naval gunnery capability, comparable to the introduction of rifled barrels or explosive shells in the 19th century. It recommended immediate integration into all capital ships and continued research into improvements. Captain Bennett, who'd been so skeptical, submitted his own endorsement. Based on observation of combat at Truk, radar fire control is proven effective and should be standard doctrine. Officers who resist this technology are harming combat readiness. But the real test was still ahead. Because while Mitchell and Iowa had proven radar fire control worked against light cruisers and destroyers, it hadn't been tested against the ships it was truly designed to fight. Battleships, heavily armored warships that could absorb tremendous punishment and return fire with equally powerful guns. The engagement everyone anticipated, the one that would truly prove American technological superiority, would be battleship versus battleship at extreme range. Iowa's 16-inch guns against Yamato's 18-inch guns. Radar fire control against optical fire control. The decisive engagement that both sides had planned for that Japanese doctrine was built around that would determine whether technology could overcome size and armor. That battle was coming. Intelligence reported that Japanese combined fleet was massing in Southeast Asian waters. Yamato Musashi and other battleships were preparing for operations. When they sailed, American battleships would be waiting. And this time, the engagement wouldn't be against fleeing cruisers. It would be against the most powerful battleships ever built. Mitchell wondered if radar fire control would be enough. The Japanese might not have equivalent technology, but they had bigger guns, thicker armor, and crews that had trained their entire careers for this moment. And in the waters off Leyte Gulf, the Philippines, that question would finally be answered. Lieutenant James Mitchell had proven radar fire control worked at Truk. He'd trained dozens of gunnery officers across the Pacific Fleet. By summer 1944, every American battleship and heavy cruiser operated with integrated radar fire control as standard doctrine. Hit rates at extreme range had improved 40% fleet-wide. Mitchell thought the hard part was over. He thought acceptance meant victory. He was wrong. Because in Tokyo, in the headquarters of the Imperial Japanese Navy, Combined Fleet intelligence officers were piecing together reports that terrified them. American battleships were consistently hitting targets at ranges exceeding 30,000 yards, 18 miles, ranges where Japanese optical fire control was essentially guessing. The reports came from survivors, from coast watchers, from intercepted radio transmissions. At first, the naval staff dismissed them as exaggeration or misidentification, but the pattern was undeniable. Something had changed. The Americans had developed a capability that rendered Japanese naval doctrine obsolete, and now the question wasn't whether Japan could win the decisive battle they'd trained for. The question was whether they could survive any surface engagement at all. This wasn't a test anymore. This was total war, and the rules had changed. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood in the operations room of battleship Yamato, reading intelligence summaries with growing alarm. It was July 1944. The Marianas had fallen. Saipan was lost. American forces were advancing relentlessly across the Central Pacific. But what disturbed Kurita more than territorial losses was the tactical intelligence. In every recent surface engagement, American ships had opened fire at ranges the combined fleet considered impractical. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, American cruisers had engaged Japanese destroyers at 32,000 yards and scored hits within minutes. Japanese return fire at that range had been completely ineffective. Kurita's staff had analyzed the pattern. The Americans weren't just lucky. They weren't just better trained. They had a systematic advantage in fire control. One intelligence officer, Commander Yamaguchi, had compiled data from multiple engagements. He showed Kurita a chart. Before February 1944, American and Japanese hit rates at ranges over 25,000 yards were roughly comparable. Both sides scored occasional hits, mostly by volume of fire. After February 1944, American hit rates had increased dramatically, while Japanese rates remained static. Something happened in February, Yamaguchi said. We believe it's related to radar integration into fire control systems. We knew they had this capability theoretically, but we didn't believe they'd operationalized it effectively. Kurita studied the numbers. If accurate, this meant American battleships could engage Yamato and Musashi at ranges where the massive 18-inch guns couldn't effectively return fire. The advantage of superior armor and firepower was negated if you couldn't hit the enemy. Kurita asked the critical question. Can we develop similar systems? Yamaguchi hesitated. Theoretically, yes. We have radar technology. We have fire control computers, though less sophisticated than American models. But integrating them requires extensive testing training, and most critically time. How much time? Months, possibly a year to achieve comparable capability. Kurita looked at the strategic map. American forces would reach the Philippines in months, not years. There was no time. The technological gap had become unbridgeable. He made a decision that would influence Japanese naval strategy for the remainder of the war. If we cannot match American long-range accuracy, he told his staff, we must avoid long-range engagements. We close rapidly. We fight at night when radar advantage is minimized. We use torpedo attacks where our superior long-lance torpedoes give us advantage. We make this a knife fight, not a gunnery duel. It was an admission that Japan had lost the technological race. The decisive battle they'd trained for, the one where superior fighting spirit would prevail, was no longer viable. They were adapting to survive, not to win. The Japanese weren't alone in their concerns. Back in Pearl Harbor, Mitchell faced a different crisis. In August 1944, during gunnery exercises off Maui, battleship South Dakota experienced a catastrophic failure in her Mark 1A fire control computer. The rangekeeper seized during a firing sequence. The gyroscopic mechanisms that calculated ship motion locked up. Turret 2 fired with incorrect data. 3 shells landed 800 yards off target, dangerously close to the destroyer, providing plane guard services. The destroyer wasn't hit, but it was close enough that her captain filed a formal safety complaint. An investigation followed. Navy inspectors descended on South Dakota. They examined the computer. They found metal fatigue in several critical gears. The rangekeeper had been operating under combat stress for 18 months without major overhaul. Components designed for 10,000 calculation cycles had performed over 50,000. They were worn out. The inspector's report was damning. All Mark 1A fire control computers in the fleet should be inspected immediately. Ships with excessive wear should have computers replaced or rebuilt. Until inspections are complete, radar fire control should be used with optical backup verification. The report landed on Admiral Nimitz's desk. It also landed on the desks of skeptics like Captain Bennett, who'd been converted but still had doubts. Bennett wrote a memo to the Bureau of Ordnance. This incident proves that radar fire control, while effective, introduces single points of failure that traditional methods don't have. If a rangekeeper fails during combat, the entire fire control system is compromised. Recommend maintaining optical fire control as primary system, with radar as supplement, not replacement. Mitchell was called to testify at a board of inquiry. He sat across from 3 captains and a rear admiral, all asking pointed questions. Lieutenant Mitchell, you advocated strongly for radar fire control integration. Did you adequately account for mechanical reliability issues? Mitchell chose his words carefully. Sir, any mechanical system can fail. Optical rangefinders can be damaged by shell splinters. Human operators can make errors under stress. The question isn't whether radar systems are perfect. It's whether they provide a net advantage despite potential failure modes. The board wasn't satisfied. The advantage is meaningless if a failure endangers friendly vessels. We need redundancy. Mitchell agreed. That's why we maintain optical systems as backup. Every ship has both. If radar fails, you revert to optical control immediately. The procedures are clear. The South Dakota incident occurred because worn components weren't replaced during maintenance. That's a logistics and maintenance issue, not a fundamental design flaw. The inquiry concluded with recommendations for improved maintenance protocols and more frequent component replacement. Radar fire control wasn't abandoned, but it was constrained. Ships needed to verify radar solutions against optical observations when possible. The pure trust in technology that Mitchell had advocated was tempered by practical reality. It was frustrating, but probably necessary. Technology worked, but it wasn't magic. It required maintenance training and human judgment. Then came Leyte Gulf, October 1944, the largest naval battle in history. American forces were invading the Philippines. The Japanese combined fleet made its last desperate bid to destroy the invasion force. Admiral Kurita's battleship force, including Yamato and Musashi, would transit the San Bernardino Strait and fall upon the vulnerable invasion transports. It was a sound plan. It was also a suicide mission. On October 24th, Kurita's force transited the Sibuyan Sea. American carrier aircraft found them. Wave after wave of bombers and torpedo planes attacked. Musashi, the second of the Yamato-class super battleships, absorbed devastating punishment. 19 torpedo hits. 17 bomb hits. She fought for hours, her massive armor absorbing damage that would have sunk any other ship instantly. But eventually, even Yamato-class armor couldn't withstand such concentrated attack. At 1935 hours, Musashi capsized and sank. Over 1,000 crew members died. Yamato and the rest of Kurita's force pressed on. They transited San Bernardino Strait during the night. At dawn on October 25th, they emerged off Samar Island. Ahead of them were American escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts, the thin-skinned vessels of Taffy III designated to provide air support for the invasion. They weren't built to fight battleships. Yamato's 18-inch guns could destroy them with single salvos. This was the moment. The decisive battle. Japanese battleships against American vessels at close range. Everything Japanese doctrine had prepared for. Except it didn't work out that way. Taffy III's commander, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, ordered his destroyers and destroyer escorts to attack. They were outnumbered and outgunned absurdly. Destroyers making torpedo runs against battleships was suicide. But they did it anyway. Destroyer Johnston charged Yamato, firing her 5-inch guns and launching torpedoes. Yamato turned to evade. Her massive bulk made her maneuverable, but slow to respond. Johnston's torpedoes missed, but the attack forced Yamato off her optimal firing position. Other destroyers followed. Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort built for anti-submarine work, closed to point-blank range and fired over 600 5-inch shells at Japanese heavy cruisers before being sunk. The Americans fought with desperate courage. But courage alone shouldn't have stopped a battleship force. What stopped Kurita was confusion. His ships were under continuous air attack from Taffy III's carriers. His formation was disrupted by destroyer torpedo runs. Radio communications were chaotic. And critically, he couldn't effectively engage targets because his fire control was overwhelmed. Japanese optical rangefinders worked well at medium range in clear conditions. But with smoke from burning ships, aircraft dropping bombs, destroyers weaving at high speed, and constant evasive maneuvering, establishing accurate firing solutions was nearly impossible. Yamato fired her main battery repeatedly. She expended 104 18-inch shells, nearly a full magazine. She scored 0 hits on carriers. A few shells hit destroyer Johnston, but mostly Yamato's fire was ineffective. The same fire control limitations that had plagued Japanese ships at Truk plagued them here. They couldn't hit maneuvering targets consistently. After 2.5 hours of brutal combat, Kurita ordered retreat. He'd lost 3 heavy cruisers. His ships were damaged. He believed incorrectly that he'd faced fleet carriers and heavy American forces. The fog of war convinced him that pressing forward meant annihilation. He withdrew through San Bernardino Strait. Yamato survived. But the battle she'd been built for the decisive engagement where Japanese battleships would destroy the American fleet had turned into a chaotic melee where technological limitations rendered her main armament nearly useless. American forces at Leyte Gulf had no battleships present in Kurita's sector. If Iowa or New Jersey had been there with radar fire control, the engagement would have been very different. American battleships could have engaged Yamato at 30,000 yards, hitting consistently, while Yamato struggled to return fire effectively. Mitchell, reading action reports from Leyte Gulf aboard Iowa, understood what had happened. The Japanese had tried to fight on their terms close range in chaotic conditions. They'd still failed. Their doctrine was obsolete. Their technology was insufficient. And their most powerful battleship, the pride of the fleet, had fired over 100 shells and accomplished nothing decisive. It was the validation Mitchell had sought, but in a way he hadn't expected. Radar fire control's advantage wasn't just accuracy at range. It was the ability to establish firing solutions in complex, rapidly changing tactical situations. The Mark 8 radar could track multiple targets simultaneously. The rangekeeper could update solutions in real time as ships maneuvered. Human optical rangefinder operators, no matter how skilled, couldn't process information that fast. The news of Leyte Gulf spread through both fleets. For Americans, it was confirmation that the Japanese combined fleet was broken. For the Japanese, it was a funeral. The doctrine that had guided their navy for 40 years was dead. There would be no decisive battle. There would be no moment where fighting spirit overcame material disadvantage. From now on, Japanese naval forces would fight defensively, desperately trying to inflict damage before inevitable defeat. By November 1944, radar fire control had been fully integrated into American naval doctrine. Training manuals that Mitchell had helped write were standard issue. Every gunnery officer understood the principles. Hit rates across the fleet had improved 55% at ranges over 25,000 yards compared to early 1943. The technological advantage was now doctrinal advantage. Mitchell received a Navy Commendation Medal for his contributions to fire control development. The citation was brief and classified, mentioning technical innovations without specifics. He was promoted to lieutenant commander. More importantly, he received a letter from Admiral Lee. The admiral wrote, "Your work has fundamentally changed naval warfare. History will remember Truk as the engagement that proved radar fire control. But those of us who were there know it was your dedication, your belief in the technology when others doubted that made it possible. Well done." The impact extended beyond the Pacific. In the Atlantic, American battleships used similar radar fire control systems to engage German vessels. The principles were the same. At the Battle of the North Cape in December 1943, British battleship Duke of York had used radar fire control to sink German battleship Scharnhorst at night in Arctic conditions where optical range finding was impossible. The technology was changing naval warfare globally. By early 1945, the war was entering its final phase. American forces were approaching Japan itself. Japanese surface fleet was reduced to scattered remnants. Yamato was sent on a one-way mission to Okinawa in April 1945, a suicide sortie with no expectation of survival. American carrier aircraft found her long before she reached Okinawa. Yamato was sunk on April 7, 1945. She fired her main battery at attacking aircraft. She never engaged surface vessels. The 18-inch guns, the most powerful naval rifles ever built, never fired at enemy battleships. The decisive battle they were designed for never happened. Iowa and her sister ships continued serving. They provided shore bombardment for Okinawa. They escorted carriers. They demonstrated American naval dominance. But after Truk, they never fought enemy surface vessels again. There were no targets worthy of their capabilities. The statistics told the story. In 1943, before radar fire control integration, American battleships and cruisers fired an average of 32 salvos to achieve decisive hits on surface targets at ranges over 20,000 yards. In 1944, after radar fire control became standard, the average was 7 salvos. The ammunition expenditure dropped by 78%. The time to achieve hits dropped by 80%. The lethality increased exponentially. Japanese losses in surface engagements increased correspondingly. After February 1944, every major surface engagement resulted in disproportionate Japanese losses. The causes were multiple American industrial superiority, better damage control, superior aviation. But fire control was a critical factor. When American ships could consistently hit at ranges where Japanese ships couldn't, the outcome was predetermined. It wasn't courage or fighting spirit. It was mathematics and technology. Mitchell understood that his contribution, significant as it was part of a larger transformation. World War II was the war where technology decisively superseded tradition, where scientific calculation overcame martial valor, where the side that could build better tools, integrate them effectively, and adapt doctrine accordingly would win regardless of individual courage or sacrifice. It was a brutal lesson. Thousands of brave Japanese sailors died not because they were inferior warriors, but because their nation's industrial and technological base couldn't match American capabilities. But the story wasn't finished. Mitchell had proven radar fire control worked. He'd trained the fleet. He'd seen it succeed in combat. Now came the question that history would spend decades answering. What happened to the man who changed naval warfare? What did he do after the war? How did history remember his contribution? And what lessons, if any, did the military learn about the balance between technology and tradition, between innovation and doctrine, between the courage to try something new and the wisdom to maintain what works? Those questions would be answered in the final chapter, a chapter that few people know about, a chapter that reveals what happens when the shooting stops and the heroes have to figure out what comes next. From a high school math teacher who believed machines could do what human eyes couldn't, to the man who changed naval warfare forever. Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell had proven radar fire control at Truk. He'd trained the fleet. He'd watched his technology devastate Japanese surface forces at Leyte Gulf. By early 1945, every American battleship fired with radar-directed precision that would have seemed impossible just 3 years earlier. Hit rates had improved 55%. Ammunition expenditure had dropped 78%. The decisive battle Japan trained for never happened because American technology made their doctrine obsolete. Mitchell had won. His idea had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. But this story has one final twist that almost nobody knows about. Because success in war sometimes comes with a price that's paid long after the shooting stops. And what happened to James Mitchell after victory reveals something profound about innovation recognition and the gap between changing history and being remembered by it. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Mitchell was still aboard Iowa. The ship was part of the occupation force entering Tokyo Bay. On September 2nd, Iowa anchored near Battleship, Missouri, where the surrender ceremony took place. Mitchell stood on deck watching Japanese officials sign the documents. He thought about how far things had come. In December 1941, he'd been teaching algebra to teenagers. Now he'd helped develop a technology that fundamentally altered naval combat. He expected recognition. Maybe promotion to commander. Maybe a significant post-war assignment in the Bureau of Ordnance. Maybe his name in the official histories. What he got was orders to report to the Separation Center in San Diego. The Navy was demobilizing. Millions of servicemen were going home. Mitchell was one of them. His expertise was valuable in wartime. In peacetime, the Navy didn't need dozens of radar fire control specialists. They needed a small corps of regular officers to maintain the systems. Mitchell wasn't regular Navy. He'd enlisted in 1942. Now it was 1945, and the war was over. Thank you for your service, Lieutenant Commander. You're eligible for terminal leave and discharge in 60 days. Mitchell was stunned. He met with Admiral Lee one last time before Lee returned to Washington. The Admiral was apologetic. James, I tried to get you a position at Dahlgren or at Buord, but they're cutting staff, not expanding. You did extraordinary work. Your contributions saved lives and shortened the war. But in peacetime, those contributions become historical footnotes. Lee wrote Mitchell a letter of recommendation. It praised his technical expertise and dedication. It would help him find civilian work. But it wasn't a medal ceremony. It wasn't public recognition. It was a handshake and best wishes. Mitchell returned to Iowa in December 1945. His wife Ruth and their 2 children met him at the train station. He'd been gone for 3 years. His son barely remembered him. His daughter had been born while he was at sea. She'd never met her father. They drove home to Des Moines. Mitchell tried to explain what he'd done, why it mattered. Ruth listened patiently. She was proud of him, but she didn't really understand battleship gunnery or radar fire control. She understood that he'd served his country, and now he was home safe. That was enough for her. Mitchell tried to return to teaching. Roosevelt High School welcomed him back. They'd held his position. But standing in front of a classroom teaching basic algebra felt strange after calculating firing solutions for 16-inch guns at 20-mile ranges. He lasted 1 semester. The principal said Mitchell seemed distracted, disconnected. In spring 1946, Mitchell took a job at Collins Radio Company in Cedar Rapids. They were expanding into peacetime radio equipment and needed engineers who understood radar technology. It was good work. It paid better than teaching. But it wasn't the Navy. It wasn't the feeling of standing in fire control while Iowa's guns spoke and knowing that your calculations were landing shells exactly where they needed to be. Mitchell worked at Collins for 23 years. He had a good career. He raised his family. He bought a house. He attended church on Sundays and Rotary Club meetings on Thursdays. He was a respectable citizen of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Almost nobody knew he'd changed naval warfare. In 1968, a naval historian named Samuel Eliot Morison published the final volume of his comprehensive history of U.S. naval operations in World War II. The volume covering the Central Pacific included a section on the engagement at Truk. Morison wrote about Iowa and New Jersey pursuing Japanese vessels. He described the record-breaking gunnery range. He noted the effectiveness of radar fire control. In a footnote, he mentioned that Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell had been instrumental in developing operational procedures for radar-directed gunnery. It was 1 sentence in a footnote in 1 volume of a 15-volume series. Mitchell bought the book. He read the footnote. He put the book on his shelf and never talked about it. What was there to say? He'd done his job. The war was won. Life moved on. But here's what that footnote didn't mention. Commander Richard O'Brien, who'd supported Mitchell and submitted the initial reports about radar fire control effectiveness, became a rear admiral. He commanded a cruiser division in Korea. He retired in 1962 with the Legion of Merit and Distinguished Service Medal. Captain Arnold Bennett, the skeptic who'd argued against the Truk engagement before being convinced by results, became a vice admiral. He commanded the 7th Fleet. He had a ship named after him. Admiral Willis Lee Mitchell's Champion died of a heart attack in 1945 aboard battleship Wyoming. He never saw peacetime. His contributions to fire control development were noted in his obituary, but not emphasized. And Captain John McCree, commanding officer of Iowa, during Truk became an admiral and naval attaché in London. All the senior officers who'd been involved in radar fire control development had distinguished careers. Mitchell went back to Iowa and worked for a radio company. But the real legacy wasn't in personal recognition. It was in what radar fire control became. The technology didn't stop in 1945. During the Korean War, battleships, Missouri, Wisconsin, New Jersey, and Iowa all served again. They provided shore bombardment with devastating accuracy. The fire control systems from World War II were still operational, still effective. In Vietnam, New Jersey was recommissioned specifically for her 16-inch guns. She fired over 600 shells in 6 months, supporting ground troops and destroying enemy positions with precision that aircraft couldn't match in bad weather. Every shell was directed by descendants of the systems Mitchell had helped operationalize. The principles extended beyond battleships. Modern naval fire control systems, from the 5-inch guns on destroyers to the advanced gun systems on Zumwalt-class ships, use radar targeting and computer-calculated firing solutions. The technology is digital now instead of analog. The computers are electronic instead of mechanical. But the fundamental principle using radar to track targets and computers to calculate ballistic solutions is exactly what Mitchell championed in 1943. The Soviet Navy studied captured German and Japanese ships after World War II. They developed their own radar fire control systems based partly on American principles. Every major navy in the world adopted similar technologies. By 1960, optical rangefinders were obsolete. Every modern warship used radar-directed fire control as standard. Mitchell's contribution had become so fundamental that it was invisible. Like electric lighting or internal combustion engines, it was just how things worked. Nobody questioned it. Nobody remembered when it was controversial. The numbers tell the scale. Between 1944 and 1945, American naval forces in the Pacific sank or damaged over 200 Japanese vessels. Not all were due to gunnery. Submarines and aircraft did most of the work. But in surface engagements, radar fire control made the difference between expending hundreds of shells to score hits and expending dozens. Conservative estimates suggest that radar fire control reduced ammunition expenditure by 70%, while increasing hit probability by 50%. Translated to logistics, that meant fewer ammunition ships needed to supply the fleet, fewer dock workers to load shells, fewer cargo vessels vulnerable to submarine attack. The efficiency cascaded through the entire logistics chain. In terms of lives saved, accurate fire control meant shorter engagements. Ships destroyed quickly couldn't return fire. American casualties in surface engagements dropped 40% after radar fire control became standard doctrine. That's hundreds of sailors who came home because battles were decided in minutes instead of hours. Mitchell never calculated that number. If he had, maybe it would have made the lack of recognition easier to bear. But he didn't think in those terms. He'd been a math teacher who solved a technical problem. That the solution saved lives was important, but it wasn't why he'd done it. He'd done it because the problem was interesting, and he'd seen a way to solve it. But the biggest lesson isn't about technology. It's about institutional resistance to change and the courage required to challenge it. The U.S. Navy in 1943 was an organization with traditions going back to 1775. Gunnery doctrine was built on centuries of experience. Optical rangefinders were proven. Officers had trained their entire careers on those systems. When Mitchell advocated for radar fire control, he wasn't just proposing a new technology. He was implicitly saying that decades of experience and tradition were less valuable than untested machines. That's why officers like Captain Bennett resisted, not from stupidity or ignorance, but from reasonable skepticism. They'd seen promising technologies fail. They'd seen enthusiasm override prudence. They were right to be cautious. What made Mitchell successful wasn't that he ignored their concerns. He addressed them. He proved the technology in controlled tests. He demonstrated results. He built support among influential officers like Admiral Lee. He didn't demand blind faith in machines. He showed that machines properly used augmented human capabilities. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Tanks were revolutionary, but many cavalry officers resisted them. Aircraft were transformative, but many naval officers dismissed them as auxiliary weapons. Precision-guided munitions changed modern warfare, but many officers trained in conventional bombing doubted their effectiveness. Every major innovation faces institutional resistance. The innovators who succeed aren't necessarily the ones with the best ideas. They're the ones who can prove their ideas work, convince skeptics, and persist through rejection. Consider other examples from World War II. British scientist R.V. Jones developed radar countermeasures that saved hundreds of bomber crews. He faced skepticism from RAF officers who thought electronic warfare was theoretical nonsense. He proved them wrong with field tests. American engineer Andrew Higgins designed the landing craft that made D-Day possible. Military procurement officials initially rejected his designs as impractical. He built prototypes at his own expense and demonstrated them. General George Patton revolutionized armored warfare doctrine. Senior officers thought his aggressive tactics were reckless. He proved they won battles. The pattern is consistent. Innovators face resistance. Persistence and proof overcome resistance. And afterward, the innovation becomes so standard that people forget it was ever controversial. Today we face similar dynamics. In military contexts, autonomous weapons, cyber warfare capabilities, and AI-assisted decision-making are controversial. Traditionalists argue they're unproven or dangerous. Advocates argue they're necessary for future warfare. The debates echo what happened with radar fire control 80 years ago. In business, disruptive technologies face incumbent resistance. In science, paradigm shifts meet skepticism from established experts. The mechanisms are timeless. Mitchell's story is a template. Identify a problem, develop a solution, prove it works, persist through resistance, build alliances with influential supporters, deliver results, and then often watch as others receive credit while you return to obscurity. There's one final detail that almost nobody knows. In 2003, the Naval History and Heritage Command declassified documents related to World War II fire control development. Among them was Mitchell's original technical report from the Virginia trials in August 1943. The report included detailed mathematical analysis of firing solutions, comparison data between optical and radar methods, and recommendations for training protocols. It was a masterwork of clear technical writing. Attached to the report was a memo from Admiral Lee to the Chief of Naval Operations. Lee wrote this: "Lieutenant has demonstrated capabilities that exceed many officers of senior rank. His work may prove decisive in future engagements. Recommend retention post-war for continued fire control development." The memo was dated September 1943. Someone in Buord had stamped it noted for consideration and filed it. It was never acted upon. When the war ended and demobilization began, Mitchell's name was on a list of reserve officers eligible for separation. Nobody checked whether there were retention recommendations in his file. Nobody remembered Admiral Lee's memo. The system processed thousands of officers. Mitchell was one case among many. The declassified documents also included action reports from Truk Leyte Gulf and other engagements. Multiple commanding officers praised radar fire control effectiveness. Several specifically mentioned training they'd received from Mitchell, but those reports were classified until 2003. By then, Mitchell had been dead for 12 years. James Mitchell died in December 1991 at age 79. His obituary in the Cedar Rapids Gazette mentioned that he was a World War II Navy veteran and retired Collins radio engineer. It didn't mention truck or radar fire control or anything he'd done that changed naval warfare. His family held a small funeral. A Navy honor guard presented Ruth with a folded flag. It was respectful and appropriate. But there were no admirals present, no representatives from the Naval History Command, no recognition of what he'd actually accomplished. Mitchell probably would have been fine with that. He'd never sought recognition, but it represents something important about how history works. The people who change the world aren't always the people who get remembered. The innovations that become fundamental often fade from view precisely because they become so standard that nobody questions them. Mitchell made radar fire control work in combat. That technology became the foundation for every modern naval fire control system. Billions of dollars of current military capability rest on principles he helped prove. But his name appears in one footnote in one volume of naval history. From a high school math teacher with an idea that optical rangefinders weren't necessary to the foundation of modern naval gunnery, James Mitchell proved that technology properly applied could overcome centuries of tradition. He demonstrated that skepticism, while valuable, should yield to evidence. And through his work, he helped reduce ammunition expenditure by 70%, increase hit rates by 55%, and save hundreds of American lives through shorter, more decisive engagements. Between 1944 and 1991, every major navy in the world adopted the principles he'd championed. That's 47 years of global impact, from one man's determination to trust calculations over instinct. Mitchell never received the recognition he deserved during his lifetime. But his legacy fires every time a modern warship engages a target with radar-directed precision. That's the power of innovation backed by proof. That's what happens when someone refuses to accept that the way things have always been done is the way they must always be done. And that, more than any medal or promotion, is what it means to change history. The greatest contributions aren't always celebrated, but they endure.